It happened on an ordinary evening, the kind that never warns you before it destroys your entire life. I remember the sky was turning orange, the streets were busy, and I was rushing home after work, thinking about nothing more than dinner and rest. I was 23, full of plans, full of energy, and completely unaware that within minutes my future would stop moving forward. The truck came out of nowhere, a loud screech, blinding headlights, then impact, violent, unforgiving, final. My body was thrown across the road like I weighed nothing at all. The world spun, sounds faded, and then there was only darkness. When I opened my eyes again, everything hurt. Machines beeped around me. The smell of antiseptic filled my lungs. My throat felt like sandpaper. I tried to move, but my body didn't respond the way I wanted it to. A nurse's voice told me to stay calm, that I had survived, but my injuries were serious. Multiple fractures, internal trauma, long recovery ahead. I heard a doctor say through blurred consciousness. My family was there. I could see them gathered near the bed. My parents, my older brother, even distant relatives who rarely visited before. Their faces looked emotional, broken even. My mother cried loudly, holding my hand like she was afraid to let go. My father stood stiff, his expression heavy, as if the world had collapsed on his shoulders. For a moment, I believed I was safe. But I didn't understand what was starting. The first weeks were pure suffering. I couldn't walk. I couldn't sit without pain. Every movement felt like fire under my skin. My family took turns staying with me, smiling gently in front of doctors and visitors, but I began noticing small changes when they thought I wasn't paying attention. Phone calls would stop abruptly when I woke up. Conversations would switch topics when I asked questions. My brother often left the room with a business call, though he never had a job before, and then came the hospital bills. They were growing fast, too fast. My father would sigh heavily every time a new invoice arrived, showing it to relatives who came to visit. My mother would say things like, "We are struggling so much. Please keep him in your prayers." People started showing sympathy. Friends, neighbors, even strangers who heard about my accident began visiting or sending messages. I didn't know it yet, but my name was slowly turning into a story people talked about. A story of pain, a story of survival, a story that was no longer fully mine. One day, I overheard my brother speaking outside the hospital corridor. His voice was lower than usual, almost excited. "Yes, donations are increasing. People are sharing it everywhere," he said. "We should update the page again tonight." Donation page? I didn't understand at the time. I assumed it was some kind of charity support for medical expenses. I was too weak to question anything deeply. My mind was often clouded with painkillers and exhaustion. But something inside me felt uneasy. The next morning, I saw my mother carefully taking photos of me while I was unconscious. She adjusted my blanket, wiped my face, and took multiple angles as if documenting evidence. When I opened my eyes slightly, she quickly hid her phone and smiled softly. "Just updating your relatives," she said. Her voice was sweet, but her eyes weren't calm. Days turned into weeks. My condition stabilized slightly, but my dependence on others increased. I trusted my family completely because I had no choice. They were my only connection to the outside world. Still, small cracks began to form in my understanding of what was happening. Why were so many strangers suddenly interested in my recovery? Why did my family talk more about support messages than my actual health? And why did it feel like my pain was being watched like a performance? I lay in that hospital bed, unaware that my accident had not only broken my body, but had opened a door to something far more dangerous than the injury itself. A truth that would take 3 years to fully reveal itself. By the time I was discharged from the hospital, I was no longer just a patient. I had become a case. That's what my family started calling it when they thought I couldn't hear. A case that needs continuous support. A long-term recovery situation. A story people are emotionally invested in. At first, I didn't understand what that meant. I was still weak, still dependent on pain medication, still learning how to sit without feeling like my bones were grinding against each other. My world had shrunk to my bed, my wheelchair, and the slow passing of days. But outside that small world, something much bigger was growing. My family had created an online donation campaign. It looked simple at first. My picture in the hospital bed, a sad caption about a young life changed forever, and a request for help with medical expenses. My mother wrote most of it, or so they said. My brother managed the updates. My father handled contacts, and donations started coming in. At first, it was small amounts, friends, neighbors, relatives who knew us. Then it spread wider. Social media posts were shared, local news pages picked it up, and suddenly strangers from different cities began contributing. Messages flooded in. We are praying for your recovery. Stay strong, brother. May God heal you soon. And then came something we never expected. International donors, people I had never met, were sending money, some even sending large amounts. One donor wrote that my story reminded him of his own son. Another said they couldn't ignore my suffering after seeing my photos. There were around 40 major donors who became deeply emotionally involved. My mother proudly mentioned them often. Look, she would say, scrolling through her phone, this family from abroad sent again. They care so much about you. I felt grateful, confused, and guilty all at once. But something strange began to happen. The updates about my condition started to sound more dramatic than reality. My recovery was slow, yes, but stable. Yet online posts described me as if I were still on the edge of life and death. Critical but fighting, still unable to walk, needs urgent therapy abroad. None of that was fully true anymore. I could sit now. I could even take a few assisted steps. But those improvements were never mentioned online. Whenever I suggested correcting it, my brother would gently interrupt. People donate because they feel the urgency, he said calmly. If we change the tone, support might drop. Support might drop. That sentence stayed in my head longer than it should have. Then I started noticing financial changes. My father, who used to worry constantly about bills, suddenly had fewer visible stress lines. My brother bought a new phone. My mother started wearing better clothes when going out. When I asked about expenses, they would say everything was still going into my treatment. But I wasn't convinced anymore. One evening, I overheard a conversation that changed something inside me. My brother was speaking on the phone again. Yes, we posted the update. He said, no, don't mention improvement yet. We need at least 1 more month of steady donations. A pause. Then he laughed lightly. Don't worry, they trust us completely. I froze. They trust us completely. It wasn't just the words. It was the tone, calm, confident, almost practiced. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling while my body ached, not just from injury, but from something deeper I couldn't name yet. The next morning, I checked my medical file when no one was around. I saw receipts, reports, and bills, but something felt off. Some charges were repeated. Some treatments were listed that I never received. When I asked my mother about it, she smiled quickly and said, hospitals sometimes make mistakes in paperwork. But her hand trembled slightly when she said it. Days passed like that, quiet confusion mixed with growing discomfort. I began to realize something terrifying. My recovery was real, but the story being told about me was not. And somewhere in that gap between truth and fiction, Money was flowing in continuously. Money I was no longer sure was being used for me. I was trapped in my own story, and the worst part was I was starting to suspect that my suffering had become valuable to the people closest to me. Time didn't move normally after that. It stretched, blurred, and repeated itself like a loop I couldn't escape. What was supposed to be a recovery period slowly turned into a life I no longer recognized. Months passed, then a year, then 3. My body healed far more than anyone had expected. The fractures mended. The surgeries became memories. I could walk again, slowly at first, then with more confidence. I could even work part-time from home. On the surface, I was getting my life back. But inside my own home, something else was still broken. The story of my accident never ended. It was still alive online, still being updated, still collecting sympathy. At first, I told myself it made sense. Maybe my family needed help. Maybe donations were still necessary for rehabilitation, therapy, medicine, or debts from the past. I didn't want to think badly of them. I kept convincing myself that love sometimes looks messy, but cracks kept widening. I noticed the donation posts never stopped. Even after I could walk, even after I could work, even after I started regaining independence, the updates continued to describe me as fragile, dependent, and in critical need. Still unable to return to normal life. Requires full-time care. Condition remains delicate. Reading those words about myself felt surreal. Because they weren't true anymore, one evening I asked my mother directly, "Why are the posts still saying I can't walk properly?" She didn't even look up from her phone. "So people don't forget," she said casually. "If we change it too soon, support will stop." That sentence hit differently now. Support will stop, not concern will stop, not help will stop. Support, like I was a project that needed funding. Like my pain had a budget. That night, I couldn't sleep. I quietly checked financial records my brother had once left open on a laptop. What I saw made my stomach tighten. Large donations were still coming in regularly. Transfers were being made into accounts I didn't recognize. And hospital bills weren't matching reality anymore. Some treatments listed were exaggerated. Some never happened. Some costs were duplicated under different names. My hands shook as I scrolled. This wasn't just misunderstanding anymore. It was maintenance. A system built around my accident, still running years after the accident ended. The next morning, I tried confronting my brother. He didn't even deny it. He leaned back in his chair, calm, almost bored. "You don't understand how these things work," he said. "People connected to your story emotionally. If we suddenly stop updating, it looks suspicious." "Suspicious of what?" I asked. He looked at me like the answer was obvious, of us losing control of the situation. That was the first time I realized something terrifying. They weren't just sharing my story. They were managing it, controlling it, protecting it, even if it meant distorting my reality. Over the next year, I started quietly gathering everything. Screenshots, bank slips, old posts, deleted messages, anything I could find when no one was watching. A part of me was still hoping I was wrong. That maybe it was all a misunderstanding stretched too far. But the evidence didn't lie. And then came the moment that broke the last piece of denial inside me. One of the 40 major donors reached out directly. He had been following my recovery since the beginning. He said something felt off. My updates didn't match reality. He wanted to know if I was okay, truly okay. We met privately. When I told him I had recovered far more than the posts suggested, he went silent for a long time. Then he said something I'll never forget. "We didn't donate for a performance," he said quietly. "We donated for you." That night, I realized the truth wasn't just hidden. It was being staged. and I had been living inside that stage for 3 years without even knowing the script. Now, for the first time, I stopped asking whether something was wrong. I started preparing to prove it. The message I sent was simple. Meet me, all of you. I will show you everything. It went out to the same circle of people who had supported my recovery for 3 years. The 40 major donors who had believed in my story, prayed for me, and funded what they thought was survival. I didn't tell my family, not at first. I wanted the truth to breathe without interference. We arranged a private video meeting. Some joined from different countries, some from different cities. Their faces appeared one by one on the screen, faces that had once looked at my hospital photos with sympathy, hope, and faith. Now they looked curious, concerned, confused. My family noticed I was unusually quiet that morning. My mother asked where I was going, but I simply said, I have to settle something important. My brother frowned but didn't push further. My father stayed silent, as he often did when tension entered the room. When I closed my door, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Control. For the first time, the story wasn't happening to me. I was going to speak inside it. At exactly 7 p.m., the call began. 40 faces appeared across the screen. I took a deep breath and I started. I want to thank you, I said first, for everything you believed you were helping me with. Some smiled gently, assuming it was a gratitude speech. But I continued, but I also need to show you something that you were never meant to see. I opened my files. One by one, hospital records, recovery reports, financial statements, donation breakdowns, screenshots of posts describing my condition long after I had recovered. At first, there was silence, then confusion, then disbelief. A donor from Europe leaned closer to his camera. Wait, you're saying you've been walking for years? He asked slowly. Yes, I said. A woman covered her mouth. But the updates said, she began. I know what they said. I interrupted gently. They were not accurate. I showed them everything. The exaggerated medical claims, the duplicated bills, the unchanged critical condition, posts from years after my recovery. The messages written about me like I was still helpless, while I was living a normal, functioning life. The room on the screen grew heavier with every slide. Then came the hardest part, the money. I said quietly, it didn't all go into my treatment. That sentence broke the silence completely. One donor whispered no, another leaned back, stunned. That can't be true, someone said, but the evidence was already there, staring back at them. And then I showed the final piece. A financial trail connecting donations to personal expenses unrelated to my medical care. Not everything was taken. Not every person was guilty of the same level. But enough had been misused to change the entire meaning of what they thought they were supporting. One by one, expressions changed: shock, anger, hurt, betrayal. One man finally spoke, his voice shaking. We believed you were dying, and you were building a life on our concern. I shook my head. No, I said softly. I wasn't building anything. I was recovering, living, healing. But the story around me was frozen in the worst moment of my life. The call grew louder, questions overlapping, emotions colliding. Then one donor said something that cut through everything. So your family used your accident. I didn't answer immediately, because saying it out loud made it real in a way I had avoided for years. Finally, I nodded. Yes, that single word changed everything. Some donors went silent, some looked away. A few were visibly shaken, processing years of trust collapsing in minutes. I continued. I didn't call you here for revenge, I said. I called you here because you deserved the truth. All of you gave from your hearts, but the story you were told was no longer the truth I was living. A long pause followed. Then one donor said quietly, we need accountability. I nodded, so do I. When the call ended, I sat alone in the quiet of my room. There was no anger in me anymore, only clarity, because the truth had finally left my body and entered the world where it belonged. And somewhere beyond that screen, 40 people now knew what I had discovered slowly over 3 years. My accident had ended long ago. But the version of it they were sold had been kept alive for profit, and now it could no longer survive the light.